No shots were fired, no borders were crossed, yet lives were destroyed. During the Cold War, the most important battles were not fought with tanks or missiles. They were fought in apartments, train stations, offices, and quiet rooms where no one was supposed to listen. Espionage was not a side activity of the conflict, it was the conflict. While the world focused on speeches, summits, and military parades, a parallel war unfolded in complete silence. Information became the most valuable weapon on Earth. Knowing what the other side was planning mattered more than how many weapons it possessed. One document, one conversation, one mistake could shift the balance of power without a single public sign. This invisible war demanded a different kind of soldier. There were no uniforms, no clear loyalties, and no guarantees of survival. Spies lived ordinary lives by design. They blended into crowds, built routines, raised families, and disappeared into normality. Their success depended on remaining unnoticed even by those closest to them. What made Cold War espionage uniquely dangerous was its permanence. Unlike traditional warfare, it never paused. There were no ceasefires, no clear victories, and no safe zones. Every day was operational. Every interaction carried risk. Trust was both essential and lethal. Governments relied on these unseen actors while denying their existence publicly. If a spy succeeded, the achievement remained classified. If a spy failed, the cost was personal and often irreversible. Arrest meant disappearance. Exposure meant erasure. There were no heroes, only liabilities. Espionage reshaped the Cold War because it transformed uncertainty into strategy. Fear was not driven by what was visible, but by what might be known. Silence became threatening. Secrecy became survival. The absence of information was interpreted as intent. For ordinary citizens, this war remained largely invisible. Yet its consequences shaped policies, crises, and near catastrophes that brought the world repeatedly to the edge. Espionage did not prevent conflict by force. It prevented it by anticipation. This was a war nobody admitted was happening, but one that never stopped. As espionage expanded, it began to reshape entire societies from the inside. Governments no longer assumed loyalty as a given. They attempted to verify it, monitor it, and measure it. Background checks, surveillance programs, and internal security structures grew quietly, justified as precautions rather than controls. The invisible war required invisible defenses. This expansion blurred the line between external threat and internal suspicion. Intelligence agencies were tasked not only with discovering what the enemy knew, but with ensuring the enemy did not already know too much. Institutions became cautious. Access was restricted. Information was compartmentalized. The goal was not openness, but containment. Espionage thrived in this environment because fear created opportunity. The more fragmented information became, the more valuable any single piece of it was. A partial document, an overheard conversation, or a routine report could acquire strategic significance once removed from its context. Spies did not need complete pictures. They needed fragments that could be assembled elsewhere. This fragmentation also increased the risk of error. Analysts worked with incomplete data by necessity. Conclusions were provisional. Certainty was rare. Yet decisions still had to be made. The Cold War intelligence machine operated under constant ambiguity, where acting too slowly risked vulnerability and acting too quickly risked catastrophe. These pressures intensified rivalry between intelligence services themselves. Success was measured not only by what was learned, but by what was denied to the other side. Counterintelligence became as important as espionage. Identifying leaks, planting misinformation, and manipulating perception became standard tools. Truth was not always the objective. Advantage was. For those caught between these forces, the consequences were severe. Ordinary people could become suspects without warning. Careers could end abruptly. Relationships could be destroyed by suspicion alone. Espionage did not need guilt to function. Doubt was sufficient. This climate reshaped social behavior. Discretion became instinctive. Political expression was measured. Trust was localized and conditional. People learned to separate public conformity from private belief. The Cold War did not require constant repression. It relied on awareness that observation was possible. The intelligence war also altered how crises unfolded. Leaders did not respond only to visible actions, but to assessments of intent. Signals were interpreted, not just received. Silence could indicate preparation. Noise could conceal movement. Espionage made uncertainty permanent. This permanence demanded discipline. Overreaction could expose methods. Underreaction could invite exploitation. Every response was calculated to reveal as little as possible while correcting course. The result was a conflict defined less by confrontation than by calibration. Over time, this calibration became routine. Espionage ceased to feel extraordinary within the system. It was assumed, expected, integrated into planning. The Cold War did not merely tolerate spying, it depended on it. And as dependence grew, so did vulnerability. A world built on secrecy could be destabilized by exposure. One revelation, one defection, one unexpected disclosure could unravel years of careful management. This was the hidden tension at the core of Cold War espionage. The war remained invisible only as long as silence held. As this invisible conflict matured, espionage began to dictate the rhythm of the Cold War itself. Major decisions were no longer made solely in response to events, but in anticipation of what intelligence suggested might happen next. The future became something to be inferred rather than experienced. Governments planned not for reality but for probabilities. This predictive mindset elevated intelligence assessments to extraordinary importance. Analysts did not merely report information, they shaped interpretation. Their conclusions influenced military readiness, diplomatic posture, and public messaging. A single assessment could justify escalation, restraint, or delay. The margin between interpretation and consequence narrowed dangerously. Yet intelligence was never neutral. It reflected assumptions, biases, and institutional pressure. Agencies were expected to produce clarity in an environment defined by uncertainty. Ambiguity was tolerated, but indecision was not. As a result, information was often framed to support existing strategies rather than challenge them. Espionage informed policy, but it also served it. This dynamic created a feedback loop. Intelligence shaped decisions, and decisions shaped the intelligence that was sought. Certain threats received constant attention, while others were minimized or ignored. Blind spots emerged not from lack of effort, but from expectation. What was anticipated was easier to detect. What was unexpected remained invisible. Defections occasionally shattered this balance. When insiders crossed lines and spoke openly, they exposed not only secrets, but the fragility of the system itself. Years of carefully managed silence could be undone by a single voice. These moments produced shock not because of the information revealed, but because they demonstrated how much had been assumed rather than known. Publicly, governments reacted cautiously. Revelations were framed, disputed, or dismissed. The credibility of intelligence was protected because it had to be. Admitting systemic failure risked eroding trust in the very mechanisms preventing catastrophe. The Cold War depended on confidence in processes that could never be fully transparent. For intelligence operatives, this environment was unforgiving. Loyalty was absolute until it was questioned. Suspicion, once raised, was rarely reversed. Careers ended quietly. Identities were erased. The system did not tolerate uncertainty about those entrusted with secrets. Silence was safer than explanation. Over time, espionage blurred the moral boundaries of conflict. Deception became routine. Manipulation was normalized. Ethical discomfort was subordinated to strategic necessity. The question was no longer whether actions were right, but whether they preserved advantage without provoking escalation. This normalization carried long-term consequences. It trained institutions to operate without accountability to the public. Decisions that affected millions were justified by information that could not be shared. Espionage insulated power from scrutiny while claiming to protect society from greater harm. The Cold War thus produced a paradoxical form of stability. Peace was maintained not through openness or trust, but through secrecy and fear of exposure. Espionage did not resolve conflict. It managed it, keeping confrontation below the threshold of disaster. And as long as that management succeeded, the invisible war continued, unseen, unacknowledged, and essential. As espionage became routine, its presence faded into the background of global affairs. Even as its influence expanded, the invisible war no longer felt exceptional to those inside it. It became procedure, protocol, an accepted layer of governance operating parallel to public institutions. Decisions were shaped by information that could not be discussed, justified by threats that could not be named. This normalization altered accountability. When outcomes were attributed to classified assessments, public debate narrowed. Policies were defended as necessary without explanation. Trust was requested without evidence. Espionage insulated authority by design, creating a space where power operated without visibility, while claiming to prevent greater harm. The intelligence services themselves adapted to this permanence. Success was no longer defined by decisive breakthroughs, but by continuity. Maintaining access mattered more than dramatic revelations. Avoiding exposure became as important as acquiring information. The best operations were those that produced no visible change at all. This emphasis on continuity reinforced conservatism. Agencies preferred known methods over risky innovation. Patterns were trusted because they had worked before. Over time, this produced institutional inertia. Espionage became effective, but also predictable. Adversaries learned to anticipate behavior, exploit routines, and manipulate expectations. Counterintelligence thrived in this environment. Misinformation was planted deliberately. Signals were distorted. Silence was used strategically. Espionage evolved into a contest not only of discovery, but of deception. The goal shifted from knowing the truth to shaping what the other side believed was true. For analysts, this created a dangerous ambiguity. Information could no longer be taken at face value. Every piece of intelligence carried the possibility of manipulation. Confidence eroded. Skepticism became mandatory. Decision-makers were forced to act without certainty, aware that both action and inaction carried risk. This uncertainty intensified the psychological strain on those within the system. Operating under constant doubt required emotional discipline. Trust was provisional. Loyalty was conditional. Isolation became common. Espionage demanded not only secrecy, but detachment, from peers, from purpose, and often from conscience. The broader impact of this detachment was subtle but lasting. When secrecy governs decision-making for long periods, it reshapes values. Transparency becomes a liability. Openness is framed as weakness. The language of necessity replaces the language of choice. Espionage does not merely collect information. It conditions how power understands itself. This conditioning extended into diplomacy. Negotiations were influenced by what was believed to be known, rather than what was openly stated. Agreements were tested against intelligence estimates rather than trust. Compliance was verified, not assumed. Espionage replaced confidence with calculation. Yet this system endured because it worked, at least in one crucial sense. Despite constant rivalry, misdirection, and suspicion, it prevented uncontrolled escalation. The invisible war absorbed pressure that might otherwise have exploded into open conflict. Espionage acted as both accelerant and brake, intensifying competition while containing its most dangerous expressions. This dual role defined its importance. Espionage did not make the Cold War safer. It made it manageable. And manageability, in a world armed with catastrophic weapons, became the highest objective. But manageability came at a cost. A global order built on secrecy, doubt, and perpetual vigilance. A war fought everywhere, acknowledged nowhere. As the Cold War approached its later stages, espionage revealed one of its most paradoxical effects. The more information was gathered, the less certainty existed. Intelligence expanded awareness, but it also multiplied doubt. Knowing more did not always mean understanding better. Often it meant confronting the limits of interpretation. This limitation forced intelligence systems to evolve again. Analysts became more cautious. Scenarios replaced predictions. Probabilities replaced conclusions. Decision-making shifted from certainty to risk management. The question was no longer what would happen, but what could happen, and how disastrous each possibility might be. Espionage thus became a discipline of restraint. Information was not collected to provoke action, but to prevent surprise. Success was defined by stability rather than advantage. The goal was to ensure that no move by the other side went entirely unseen, even if its meaning remained unclear. Total clarity was impossible. Partial awareness was sufficient. This mindset profoundly influenced how crises were resolved. Back-channel communication, deniable contacts, and indirect signaling became essential. Espionage was no longer limited to stealing secrets. It facilitated communication where official channels could not. In this way, spies sometimes prevented conflict not by deception, but by maintaining awareness that escalation would not go unnoticed. For those operating in the field, however, the risks did not diminish. Exposure remained final. Identities remained disposable. As political tensions shifted, yesterday's asset could become today's liability. Espionage offered no retirement, no recognition, and no guarantees. Its participants existed permanently between usefulness and expendability. When the Cold War formally ended, espionage did not disappear. The structures built to manage secrecy, surveillance, and uncertainty were too deeply embedded to be dismantled easily. Intelligence agencies adapted their missions, but retained their methods. The invisible war had proven its value, and the habit of secrecy endured. This persistence revealed a final truth about Cold War espionage. It was never merely a response to rivalry. It was a model of governance under extreme risk. It taught institutions how to operate without trust, how to manage fear without panic, and how to act decisively without public justification. The Cold War may have concluded without a decisive battle, but the systems it relied upon did not dissolve. Espionage remained as a quiet inheritance, shaping how modern states perceive threat, power, and uncertainty. The world learned to expect that what mattered most would remain unseen, and in that expectation lies the enduring legacy of the invisible war, a global order conditioned to operate in shadows, long after the reasons for those shadows have faded. When the Cold War finally receded, it did not leave behind clarity. It left behind habits. Decades of secrecy, surveillance, and controlled uncertainty had reshaped how power operated, and those structures did not vanish simply because the rivalry lost its original form. The invisible war had proven too effective to abandon. Espionage had not merely supported the Cold War. It had defined its rhythm, its boundaries, and its survival. By absorbing tension into silence, it allowed confrontation to remain contained. By replacing open conflict with hidden competition, it prevented catastrophe while normalizing distrust. The world avoided disaster, but it did so by accepting a permanent state of suspicion. This acceptance carried a cost that is often overlooked. When secrecy becomes the default, accountability erodes quietly. Decisions affecting millions are justified by information that cannot be shared. Authority operates beyond scrutiny, while claiming necessity. Espionage did not create this dynamic, but it perfected it. The individuals who carried out this work disappeared into anonymity. Their successes were classified. Their failures were denied. History rarely recorded their names because recording them would have undermined the system itself. The invisible war could not afford memory. It depended on silence even after it ended. Yet the most enduring legacy of Cold War espionage is not institutional. It is psychological. The conflict taught the world to assume that what is most important is hidden, that official narratives are incomplete by design, that silence often matters more than noise. These assumptions continue to shape how modern societies interpret power, threat, and truth. Espionage revealed a reality that is uncomfortable to acknowledge. Stability in an age of extreme power often depends on mechanisms that cannot be openly defended. The Cold War survived not because it resolved its contradictions, but because it learned to manage them invisibly. This is why the war nobody admitted was happening mattered so much. It was not a sideshow. It was the central mechanism through which the Cold War avoided destroying itself. Tanks and missiles threatened destruction. Spies managed the fear of it. The invisible war did not end with victory or defeat. It ended by becoming routine. Its method survived its context. Its logic persisted beyond its necessity. The world moved on, but it did so carrying the tools of secrecy forward, and that may be the most unsettling lesson of all. Not that espionage existed, but that once societies learned to govern in shadows, they rarely return fully to the light.